Dr. Hannah Timmins, welcome to Project 100.
Amazing. Thank you for having me.
Again, and we've got a great relationship with Neura. You're from Neura.
I am.
And
Yeah.
when I say from Neura, it sounds like another planet. You're from Neura, but Neura being one of New South Wales' leading research units in relation to, let's call it, brain diseases and related things to the brain. Maybe you could just give us a bit of an idea about your qualifications, like what have you studied and what are you currently doing at Neura?
Yeah, lovely. So I've always been very interested in the brain. So I did a Bachelor of Science, majored in neuroscience, and then I went on to actually work as part of Matthew Keenan's clinic. And during that time, I did my PhD. And I was very lucky. Matthew was one of my PhD supervisors. So I looked during that time at neurodegeneration. And I've carried on working for him since. So now I'm here at Neura, and we look at various neurodegenerative diseases across motor neurons disease, dementia, neuropathy, generally healthy brain aging. That's our main focus, working with Matthew at Neura.
You used the word neuropathy. What is neuropathy?
So neuropathy generally relates to nerve damage in the periphery. So obviously the central nervous system is generally your brain and your spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is all the nerves that communicate that information to and from the brain.
It's very interesting. So often we think of the brain as being sort of a lone ranger sitting up there in your head, but in actual fact the brain has connections all the way through your body, through your nervous system. And so your nervous system is considered part of your neural system or your neuropathy or part of the whole brain system.
Correct.
Even your eyes perhaps
yes,
considered
definitely.
to be part of your brain because
Absolutely.
they connect straight to your brain. They're sort of sensor. And the nerves, say, in your fingers. And what's always I've found quite curious the other day, I was listening to someone talk about it, and we always think of our muscles as sort of dumb facilities in our body. Just they look a certain way and they perform a certain function. But actually, I heard that our muscles actually send signals back to the brain and tell us how like I don't know what they tell us, but they tell us our brain's something, and our brain sort of has a relationship with our muscles.
Yeah,
is that through the nervous system?
Yeah, absolutely. So generally, there's various structures, but I guess the biggest one would probably be the motor system. So that's where your brain's sending signals down through your nerves to your muscles, and they also can send signals back, and it gives you proprioception is also involved there as well. So
what's that word?
Proprioception, how we sort of sense the world around us. So that kind of feeling where you are in space. There's that general back and forth feedback's happening there.
That's very interesting. And one of the areas you're been working in at Neura is in relation to the effects of metabolic health, or how metabolic health affects our brain, or particularly the aging brain. What is it meant by? What do people mean by metabolic health? Now and probably maybe you could expand on that. Like, what does metabolic disease even mean? Like, how does that? What does metabolic health mean?
I mean, I guess in the broader term, generally it's also talked about in cardiometabolic health. So, that's obviously the cardiovascular system, and then metabolism relates to energy, how we utilize it, and that obviously also happens in the brain. And I guess when this goes awry, it also has a big impact on your body in general, but definitely in your brain. Your brain and your nervous system are very energy dependent. So if you disrupt that energy, be it through not being able to utilize the fuel properly or not being able to carry it there through your vascular system, generally that will have a negative impact on the brain and how we age and longevity and how you function.
Which comes first, or maybe they're not the one, but is it aging affects metabolic health, or is it metabolic health can sort of affect or can increase your aging rate?
I mean, it's a little bit of both. Obviously, as you age, various systems decline and things like that, and we're less efficient in those things. We're more prone to those risk factors that affects the vasculature, and more likely to develop diabetes and reduce fitness. But equally, controlling those factors can then improve your longevity and your health. So, obesity is one of the biggest crises we have in Australia. I think it's something unfortunate. Around 66% of adult Australians are overweight or obese.
Whoa.
I know. And unfortunately, 26% of children
No.
are overweight and obese. So obviously this is a big factor, and obesity majorly impacts that cardiometabolic health. So in terms of hypertension, high blood pressure, insulin resistance, diabetes, even toxicity and inflammation from the obesity itself, all that can impact your systems and especially your brain. So recently, I think you might find this interesting, I read that obesity itself can lead to what they call a metabolic inflammation. And this can affect areas of your brain, including the hypothalamus. And this is an area that's involved in appetite regulation. So actually, by eating these poor diets and becoming obese, you can then actually, it's this terrible perpetual cycle of then dysregulating your appetite, and you might end up then eating these bad diets more and more and causing these systemic problems.
So in your research currently, you mentioned cardiometabolic health.
Mm-hmm.
I remember once Matthew Kinnan telling me what's good for your heart's good for your brain.
That's it. You coined the term, yeah.
It's just pretty simple but easy one to remember, but sort of covers a lot of ground. But at the same time, we're being a bit presumptuous, like I am at least, and he is in relation to me, because I sort of get it, but I don't really get it. Maybe you could sort of just explain to us through your research, what are you finding? Like when you talk about, like, our heart is here, of course, our vascular system's everywhere. That's all the veins and arteries, I guess, connecting to the heart. How does our vascular system have an effect on our metabolic health, or is it metabolic health has an effect on our vascular system, or is it both?
Yeah, they work a little in tandem. So I guess, for example, insulin resistance. So that can happen if you're eating over a long period of time, high fat, high sugar diet, overeating. And insulin, it's involved in, again, regulating that hunger, but also how well we utilize glucose. And then over a long period of time, you become diabetic. Diabetes can affect that microvasculature, especially in the brain. It can also affect things like the back of the eyes and things like that.
But what do you mean by microvasculature?
So the very small blood vessels that are involved in supplying the brain and the nerves with blood supply. So that's one example. Another will be, high bad cholesterol obviously can lead to reduced blood flow through the blood vessels.
As a result of blockages.
Blockages, yes, correct. And also, again, inflammation as a general process can disrupt the vasculature. One thing you might find interesting, that's obviously in the brain, but even in the peripheral nervous system, you can end up with pretty bad nerve damage from these processes. The metabolic syndrome can impact that. Obviously, we know, through diabetes, you can get something called diabetic neuropathy, where you end up getting nerve damage, and unfortunately, people can lose limbs. But interesting, one of our collaborators overseas, is brilliant lady called Eva Feldman, did some very interesting work where she found, even amongst obese individuals who didn't have diabetes, around 11% of them still had some levels of nerve damage. So I think it just speaks to it's a whole system process, and how delicate your brain and nervous system is, and how we live our lifestyles can really impact our overall health and functioning.
So in terms of metabolic health then, and I'll come back to, I have another question about how your poor metabolic health can affect your vascular system, which then doesn't perhaps feed your nervous system, probably, therefore you get nerve system damage as well. We'll come back to that in a second. But in terms of metabolic health, who or what is the culprit? Like what's sort of, let's just put aging aside. Let's say, you're 40 or 30 or whatever. Who's the culprit in relation to poor metabolic health, or what is the culprit?
Obviously, like everything in life, it's multifactorial. But in terms of, I think, what we can control, it really is diet and lifestyle. So a lot of the studies have sort of suggested that these high-fat, high-sugar diets, they can disrupt, as I said, your insulin, create this low-grade inflammation, which then in itself isn't just affecting the vasculature, but can directly affect the brain cells. And even then, if you also are resistant to insulin, which is one of the hormones we use to be able to get the fuel into the brain cells, then your brain can't utilize its fuel appropriately. And then there's been some evidence that then it can affect areas, especially relating to memory. So hippocampus is very important in memory. And they've shown in people who have these metabolic syndromes, there can be shrinkage of these areas. So I think, as I said, multifactorial, but it is heavily related to diet and lifestyle. But the good news is that then means on the opposite end of that, you can do things that are protective.
Yeah.
So, example, exercise can be.
So, if I could just pull out of that,
of course,
that little summary there, which is very scientific.
Sorry.
No, first of all, for our audience, though. So, you said poor diet, and I might first start off with what do you mean by poor diet, or what does the evidence suggest in relation to what is a poor diet?
So again, and a lot of the studies they've done would be centering around high fat diets. So, but again, sort of quote unquote bad fats. Obviously, we still need a level of fats, but it's these high fat diets and also high refined sugar. So again, if you're constantly flooding your system.
So you're eating Kit Kats all day long?
Yeah, as delicious as that sounds, and I do need a break every now and again, probably not all day long.
Yeah. But that's an example. Like
that's an example.
As an extreme dumb thing to say,
no,
as it
absolutely.
is. But if you ate Kit Kats a day,
yes, probably.
So that's a poor diet. The Kit Kats, which are full of sugar, and I'm not having to go Kit Kats. I love a Kit Kat, but like the Kit Kats are great. But I mean, if you ate too many, like everything, moderation is key. But if you ate too many, which means you're getting too much sugar, maybe they just explain how you become insulin resistant. In other words, because we need our insulin to be pumping out, get that sugar to bring everything back into balance.
Yes.
And also to deliver that insulin to the right places. I mean, it's obviously going to, deliver that sugar that glucose to the right places, and what's left over to stick in the liver to process it. I presume that's the process.
Yeah.
And somehow, if we keep hitting ourselves up with too much sugar, I think what you're saying is our insulin becomes resistant to that. It sort of says, hey, I'm used to you loading yourself up with Kit Kats. We're not going to respond the way I respond with anybody else. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah. So it's actually the cells themselves that become
resistant to the insulin.
resistant to the insulin. So again, the process is you'll eat sugar, which is normal. We need to do that to a degree, and then your pancreas releases this hormone insulin, and that helps facilitate getting the sugar where it needs to go
to the body cells,
to the body
into
cells,
the brain,
into the brain, into your whatever cells you need. And as you, I guess, overtax your cells become resistant.
They shut shop. They said we've got enough.
We're had enough.
Yeah.
But then the problem is then you're required then to produce more insulin to get the same level of, and over time, your pancreas can't produce basically anymore, become a bit tapped out. And that's when you start developing type 2 diabetes.
Right.
Will be when you're at a point where, you can no longer keep up with the demand, which is obviously a bit different to, that's type 2 diabetes.
But insulin resistant is a precursor, let's call it, to type 2 diabetes. So you become insulin resistant first, and then you get type 2 diabetes. And basically, they just, because it's sort of, I can get it clear in my mind, it's becoming much clearer. It's that if in our life, as we're living it for over many years, and many periods within those years, we are having a crap diet, for argument's sake, and our body's doing what it should do. Pancreas producing insulin's grabbing hold of the sugar, tapping the cells and delivering it, and the cells are saying, "Hang on, we're shut up shop because we've been doing this too long. We know you're going to come around in 50 minutes with another Kit Kat. We don't need any more."
Sounds like a good Saturday.
Yeah, and you become it does, a rainy day, and then you become insulin resistant, and over time, you become a type 2 diabetic, where you can't rebalance the amount of sugar or glucose in your system because the insulin just can't do its job.
Correct. Yeah.
And then you're a diabetic.
Yeah.
And now you've got a metabolic disease.
Essentially, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which means, if I could just go one step on, does that mean then because insulin can't do its job anymore effectively, does that mean that we don't get sugar to our cells?
No, you do, but obviously it's not as effective, and then generally that's why then people who do become full-blown diabetic will require medication.
Yeah. And what does the medication do?
Depends on the medication.
Yeah. Let's say it's Ozempic.
So that's a slightly different.
That's to lose weight.
Slightly different. I mean, it was originally developed because it can help increase insulin sensitivity. But the side effect of that with the weight loss is because it's GPL-1 analog, which essentially simulates one of the satiety hormones and helps reduce appetite.
Oh, so we're not hungry. So we stop eating Kit Kats. I don't want a Kit Kat anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. That's a pretty crude way of doing it.
Or you only end up wanting one Kit Kat instead of 7.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like, you know, that's I mean, they've been obviously out and have been sort of, I guess, moving towards more of that weight loss model. So that's how that mode of action works.
So let's not pick Ozempic then. So let's say you're on some other diabetic injection. You're injecting yourself with what do you inject? What do they inject?
Again, depending how severe your diabetes with, you might need to be injected with actual insulin. A lot of people take metformin, which again just helps reduce the insulin resistance. That's quite a common medication. But if you are very severely diabetic, then you would probably have to replace the insulin in those circumstances.
So this solves, well, this informs us what you're talking about now, the dietary part of bad metabolic health. What about other lifestyle factors that could affect metabolic health? Are there other things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, physical activity, it sounds like a footnote, but it actually has profound physiological effects, especially on the brain. There's been some interesting research coming out of America where they're saying even the actual action of exercise has obviously a lot of cardio health and, you know, all the things we know about. But one of the, I guess, favorite food sources of your brain cells, which is lactate, which is broken down glucose, actually increases when you exercise. So essentially you're almost increasing that easy fuel for your brain by doing exercise. And similarly, it has, you know, effects on, improving the blood flow to the brain, you know, again, mitigating some of those other cardiometabolic risk factors like high blood pressure, you know, helps overall with, you know, improving insulin sensitivity. If you've got more muscle mass, you're generally a bit more insulin sensitive, and that helps.
And insulin sensitive, if that's the opposite to insulin resistance.
Yes.
Because your cells are more sensitive to the insulin, therefore more likely to be affected by the insulin.
Yes.
Bring it in.
So yeah,
you've got more doors are open.
Yeah.
So to speak, in a very crude way, I'm putting it, of course. And what does it mean by, you said activity? You seem like you were purposely not saying exercise. What do you mean? What are we talking about here? Because in terms of metabolic health, is there like a gold standard to make sure we try and avoid as best we can bad metabolic health? Is there a gold standard when it comes to activity?
I mean, the recommendation, the government recommendation is 150 minutes a week, but I've seen some studies that are saying any movement is beneficial. You know, if you could do 10, 20 minutes a day moving, it's better than doing nothing. Even that can help.
Moving, like just getting up and walking around the house.
Walking is great exercise. Obviously, again, there's always going to be, I guess, a dose effect of how much exercise and what you're doing. You know, getting your heart rate up and resistance training, you know, that's always helpful. In terms of longevity, anything that can help sort of, I guess, improve those aspects of your metabolic health and fitness, cardiovascular fitness. But I think just encouraging any level of movement is a good place to start.
But most people would I mean, I can understand if you're 90 or something and movement's difficult. I can get that. But if you're a young whippersnapper like yourself, you probably have much more capacity than to move between the lounge room and the fridge and
Absolutely.
the fridge and the laundry. And so it's all sort of pretty all relative, of course, but what would you say that the research is indicating in relation to people in their 30s and 40s? I mean, what is movement? What do you mean by movement for them? Do you mean like, okay, Mark, you need to do 100, and I've heard Peter Attia say this, but you need to do 150 minutes a week of what he can call zone 2 exercise, which is zone 2's, depends on how old you are, but it's like 80% of your maximum heart rate. Maximum heart rate being 220 minus your age, sort of, within reason, and 80% of that, you should hold that for 3 sessions of 50 minutes or 5 sessions of 30 minutes, but each week. I don't know why they pick weekly. I mean, maybe they could put, but it doesn't matter. Each week. He adds a whole lot of other stuff to it, but just that's a minimum. Maybe you could explain the correlation between your heart rate and a healthy heart that can actually do this. And by the way, at that level, it's not exhausting exercise. We're talking about one way of assessing this, I've been told, is that zone 2 is when you, let's say you're running or you're walking, you're able to still to speak. People say at your age, to get your heart rate up to that zone 2, which is, I was just saying earlier, it's a rate at which you can run or walk or row or bike, where you can still talk without gasping. But you've got to do that. But that's really important. You've got to do that somewhere between 130, 150 minutes a week. By the way, it doesn't have to be 151. It doesn't matter if it's 149. It doesn't matter if it's 138. Like somewhere in between, whatever. For younger people, how is that? How does that actually help our brain? Like, what are the mechanisms by which our brain's getting a benefit from that? Is it because blood's pumping through our brain, or is it because we're burning all the sugar up, or what is it, or is it maybe all of those things? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a few mechanisms. One, as you say, it's improving that overall cardiovascular fitness. Like Matthew says, it's good for the heart, it's good for the brain. So if you improve that cardiovascular system and you've got that better blood flow, you've got better control over your blood pressure, and you're perfusing the brain better.
What's that mean?
Sorry, so you're supplying the brain with blood supply and oxygen, and you're removing, some of the rubbish that after it uses up, that's always going to be beneficial. And as I mentioned before, there's also other aspects where it's helping in terms of reducing inflammation. It's potentially increasing the amount of easy fuel for the brain. I mean, it has other
easy fuel being the glucose converted to
lactate.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I mean, even slightly off topic, but still related, is obviously exercise can improve things like depression, and depression is known to be one of the modifiable risk factors for dementia and healthy brain aging. So all these things can work synergistically to improve. And I think aiming for that overall healthy lifestyle, trying to, as you say, aim for at least that exercise where you're getting your heart going, and if you can, especially when you're younger, but not just when you're younger, resistance training, improving that, I guess you describe it as lean muscle mass, that has a lot of benefits in longevity, brain health, but in other ways as well. So I think if you can do a bit of that cardio, you can do a bit of that weight training, resistance training at any age, that's going to be beneficial.
Yeah, and in a non-scientific or academic scientific format, like citizen scientist style, is it an easy summary for me just to say, apart from what's good for the heart is good for the brain, is that if we can produce more blood flow to the brain, it's just like flushing out the system. Like blood flow to the brain is the brain needs blood flow. It
Absolutely.
needs nutrients, it needs oxygen, and it just needs stuff flowing through it. It needs and because all your neurons up there are hanging out for like every other cell in your body. They're looking for oxygen and nutrients. It's not like your brain's doing weightlifting, but it's like it needs all this other stuff going on. And the only way I'm going to get blood flow to my brain, apart from having healthy arteries and things like that deliver the blood, I've got to be moving. If I'm just sitting in one spot, I'm not getting anywhere near the blood flow that I would do if I'm exercising or doing stuff.
Yeah.
And you don't have to exercise 24 hours a day, but you just got to do it at least every day or every second day for a period just to get it up into a certain rhythm.
Yeah.
Is that a fair, citizen scientist description?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously in a long-term effect, like you said, making sure you've got that vascular health, we want to reduce our risk of strokes and anything that could disrupt blood flow that way. But even in an acute way, obviously there's some evidence to suggest that exercise does improve that immediate cognition and awareness and alertness. So, doesn't suit everyone, but anecdotally, that's why I prefer to do exercise in the morning. It sets me up and then I feel switched on for the rest of my day. So
it's pretty obvious, especially someone like you, this stuff. I mean, you study this stuff, you research it, you write about it. It's interesting. I never really thought about this much, but people like you must be sort of not obsessed, but it's like eating a meal. It's just part of your day. I
mean, there's a little bit of do as I say, not I do sometimes, Mark. You got to live life still. But look, I do try. Obviously, you come across this and like anything, knowledge is power and you try and live your life a little bit according to what you know. But yes, I'm sure there's a balance, isn't there? And you've got to also consider lifestyle factors. I mean, I always say one of the other modifiable lifestyle factors for dementia is actually socializing and, enjoying that lifestyle. And if that involves, occasionally enjoying yourself, you're not just a slave to having a beer, having a meal and whatever, there's an element there to be considered rather than just regimentally sticking with this perfect, pristine diet and exercise regime. So maybe there's a little bit of that to consider as well.
Now you talked about vascular health, which I presume is the health of your blood delivery system. And I presume you're talking about every part of the vein or artery, inside, outside. I'm sure there's lots of layers to it. And inflammation of your vascular system, is that a thing? Like, can we get it inflamed? Like the epithelial cells that are inside your veins could be dying off, or they're not getting enough nutrition, or you're putting too much pressure on them from blood pressure on them, just too much pressure on them, or does exercise help them stay young and vibrant and fresh? I mean, because we never break down our cells at a cellular level, but like we talk about vascular system, but our vascular system is basically a whole lot of cells. What is it we should be doing to keep our vascular system healthy? Because the vascular system feeds the brain, feeds the nervous system, feeds every cell. There are highways. You've got to make sure if there's potholes, we've got to be filling them up. What are some of the research that you've been doing and you're involved in, or you've read or comes out of Neuro that tells us what we should be doing about our vascular system relative to how it affects our metabolic health generally, and therefore how it affects our brain ultimately?
Okay. I mean, as I said, so a lot of those modifiable risk factors. So recently, there's been this big commission, and it sort of talks to brain health in general, but in the context of dementia. And there's 14 modifiable risk factors. And
wow,
of those 14.
We now know it's actually 14.
There's 14.
You're going to rattle them off to me?
I can do, but I'll start off by saying, and I find this interesting, of the 14, 6 are directly related to this cardiometabolic health, right?
So there's 14 risk factors,
modifiable risk factors.
So there's 14 factors that if we can change.
Yeah, and I think the study suggested if we can address them, then up to 45% of cases of dementia could become preventable.
Right. So there's 14. So I'll ask you if you can remember them.
I can. I'll
and
try.
But there's also 6
of the 14 are specifically related to what we're talking about here.
The vascular system.
The vascular system and that metabolic health, things like that.
Great.
So, I mean, I can
please
tell
do.
you all 14
no,
more,
I like to know
but
that.
starting the non-cardiometabolic one, because I'm sure we'll go from there. So head injury is one of them.
As in getting hit in the head.
Hit in the head.
Yep.
Social isolation, as we mentioned. Depression. Pollution. Low educational attainment. And then we've got the ones relating a bit more to cardiometabolic health. So we've got hypertension, so high blood pressure, uncontrolled. We've got diabetes, as we've mentioned, all this blood sugar. We've got obesity, especially at midlife. So they've found that.
When's midlife?
Midlife, this is sort of 40s to 60s. So interestingly, it's good to start these things any time, but they've shown, really sort of knuckling down at that point really helps then your long-term aging. What was I up to? Cholesterol, bad cholesterol.
LDL, as in LDL.
Yeah. Where I'm up to. How many is that?
I don't know. I'm not counting. It sounds like it's pretty close to 14.
Pretty close.
Well, maybe so. Let's look at the 6 then.
Yes.
Can you tell me what the 6 are particularly?
So those in particular, as we say, high blood pressure. So obviously that relates specifically, like what you were talking about, your blood vessels, and you want to generally keep that control because of the stress you're putting on the system. Diabetes. As we said, all this relating to blood sugars. There's obviously the sort of, I guess, immediate effects of the insulin and the glucose, but then there's the longer term complications. So people with diabetes generally, again, they're more prone to things like strokes and heart attacks.
Why is that? Because
and in general, it's just, again, this poor metabolic syndrome, and they generally have this problems with their vasculature is affected by the dysregulation of the glucose. There tends to be other comorbid, the inflammation processes can affect things like that. So they tend to, again, be not metabolically very well. In terms of the peripheral nervous system, the nerves are very delicate in terms of their energy and things like that, and they're very easily prone to damage. So again, if that blood glucose is not well controlled, it can end up with the nerve damage.
And when you get the nerve damage, that's when people lose a limb or a foot or a hand or whatever. My grandfather, on my father's side, on paternal side, my grandfather, diabetic, heavy diabetic, type 2, had to cut his leg off.
Yes.
Because he didn't move. He just sat.
Yes.
Just literally sat in his chair with his cane. When we used to go in to see my papa, he'd sit there all the time and didn't move. I don't remember ever seeing him stand up, move away from that chair ever in my whole life. When I was like 10 or 11 when he died, he had a lot of sugar, and because he just thought he left a war-torn country, so he come to Australia and thought, well, I'd eat what I like here and get what I like, and then they cut his leg off, and because he was pretty old, they couldn't anaesthetize him. Generally, they just gave him a local there, so he couldn't feel it. But he died of a heart attack then, just through the stress of it.
Yeah.
What in those days, we're talking about a long time ago, 50 years ago. But obviously, feeling his leg get sawn off was too much for him. But yeah, it's interesting because his nervous system sort of just stopped working in his legs, or one leg in particular, and then he got gangrene. And from the whole process, and that's why they had to cut his leg off. But that makes sense to me. Like his nervous system, or his which is all part of the brain system, just pretty much gave up. And he was overweight, and as you say, he ate, his sugar intake was crazy. I just remember he used to be munching on lollies all the time. This is pre people knowing even what all this stuff was. It's like long time ago. But that makes sense to me what you're saying. That it's a preventable risk. Like his wife, my grandmother, she never did what he did. She just stuck to her old diet that she had 2 meals a day. She, was a skinny little Greek woman, lived forever. But the difference between the two is just on what they consumed, and how he lived. He didn't move. He just sat there like the king, of the gee, that's what he has all his sons, a million kids, and and they're all a million grandkids, and we all used to go there and sort of pay honour to my grandfather sitting there in the corner. And he was like the king of the big family, and whereas my grandmother, she was running around all the time making food, building a garden, like making sure that everything was fresh, and feeding him up, thinking that he's my king, I've got to feed him. And what does he want? He wants sugar. I'll give him whatever he wants, cake, whatever. But nothing ever happened to her, and because she remained like she was probably meant to, like physically be a sort of a slim person. And that makes a lot of sense to me as you go through that. What you're saying is complex, but like if I'm just looking at trying to dumb it down a little bit for myself, exercise, movement, proper diet, and metabolic health, general metabolic health, because I don't think people really are conscious of the term metabolic health.
No, I mean it's a fairly, I'd say it's probably a new-ish area. I think we're probably appreciating a little bit more how these systems are not in isolation, right? And how it's sort of what can happen earlier in your life and your lifestyle, how that really can impact. We're sort of moving a bit more towards this model of looking at the system as a whole. So I think it is more of a newer area sort of coming together, and how that then impacts different systems like the nervous system. So there was obviously known things about diabetes for a long time, but I think it's probably more of a new area of research, really understanding how we're impacting the brain and those neurodegenerative conditions, and not just throwing away exercise, oh it's good for you, there's actual physiological processes here that are underway that are really helping with longevity and healthy brain aging.
Because I think I heard somewhere, read somewhere that diabetes sometimes can be referred to as a form of Alzheimer's, or has some relationship to a form of Alzheimer's. Is that correct?
So, I've heard it in the opposite way. I've heard Alzheimer's described as almost a type 3 diabetes.
Maybe around the other way. Okay, maybe it's...
Yeah. So again, I think it's relating to all the things we've discussed about the insulin resistance. There is some evidence as well to suggest that having these kind of metabolic syndrome can even increase the likelihood of these, how would you describe them, the bad proteins that can accumulate in your brain, so the amyloid plaques and tau. So I think there's a lot, again, this movement towards is what's going on. Again, we've seen this massive increase, probably even since your grandparents' day, of obesity. The rates of obesity are humongously increased in Western world, and I think that's therefore it's becoming more evident how these things are impacting these other systems. And as we're sort of getting older and aging, we're seeing these risk factors come out a bit more.
And they're not independent. So,
no.
I mean, growing up, I always thought that, like later in my life, I always thought that diabetes was just like a problem with your insulin, and it wasn't. It didn't seem. I don't think people used to talk about it having an effect on your heart or your brain. But now, if you go along to your doctor and you get your bloods done, and or perhaps there's some marker in there in relation to the amount of sugar that you've got in your system. I don't know which one it's called. One of those ones. I mean, I don't know what it's called, but I mean, if for some reason they see that your sugar levels are high in relation to your blood test, it may be informing us that we should be going off to perhaps get a glucose test, or I don't know what it's called now, but Matthew Kiernan sent me to have one just for sort of like, I won't say for the fun of it, but for safety or for more research reason, right, in relation to me, where they gave me this drink down here at St. Vincent's, and it was like disgustingly sweet, and you drink it. You take a blood test before, you drink it, you take a blood test after, and it's a test to sort of see how your insulin and can grab hold of the sugar in your system over what period of time, and get you back to, I think, what they call homeostasis, like balance, back to normal, back to the way you were before you had the thing. I had no food or anything before it, and if you're if there's no point getting a blood test and somehow you're finding that your blood sugars are a bit high, and not going and doing the next test to see whether or not you are either insulin resistant or you have a complete problem, you're a diabetic, or just about to become diabetic. Because if you don't do that, you don't find out, then you can't intervene in your lifestyle, all those factors that are affecting this or causing this. Because if you don't do that, then ultimately you could end up having Alzheimer's or you could end up having a heart problem. Is that the sort of what – I mean, I know what you're doing is really niched, but the broader view on that is overall health to helping us live longer.
Absolutely. I think, as I said, I'm obviously talking in this one niche area, but it's a whole system thing, and I think it speaks very important. I think having good general practitioners and also educating people about these things, ask for those tests, go see your GP if you think something's up, look into investing in your health and lifestyle. And all these things are things we can do to really help our longevity, not just from a neurological perspective, but, all around. Yeah.
Yeah, because, and probably the very first, even if you don't get a blood test, but maybe if someone's listening to this, one of the very first things we could be thinking to ourselves is, well, Boris just said, if you eat 10 Kit Kats a day, well, that's a bit ridiculous. but if you're eating consistently a lot of Kit Kats or a lot of whatever chocolate, and you're eating a lot of processed bread, and if you're eating a lot of processed rice, and if you're drinking lots of beers, and I don't mean you're drunk or you're eating a loaf of bread, just lots of this over a long period of time, that should be your first marker. The marker should something we observe. Yeah, maybe I should go and get a blood test. And then they might test your blood, you might be fine. Nothing. But you might find something on there that leads you to the next test. And I think it's up to us to ask our general practitioner, because the problem is I think a lot of people, they wait until they're actually sick before they go to see the GP. What I mean by sick is actually ill. Maybe vomiting or passing out or missing days at work or whatever that indicator is, when in actual fact there's always something before that. It's a lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, sometimes, you might get those blood tests and it might still be within quote unquote normal, but there's a process before that's happening, right? So you might be becoming on your way to being insulin resistant or diabetic, or your lifestyle is not conducive, and then it will be showing up at a point where we've already got to this point, right? So you want to be able to intervene, as you say, before something is wrong, and be living in that preventative way within reason, as we say. You gotta have a Kit Kat every now and again.
But you can prevent these things, is what you're saying.
Well, largely, I mean, obviously, like Matthew likes to say, you can't choose your parents, you can't choose everything about your life, but if we can address some of these modifiable things that are within our control, you can mitigate those other factors that you can't control to a good degree.
Yeah, that's interesting, because even those 14 modifiable risk factors, to me, seem like non-negotiable. Everybody should be looking at them and just scanning down them every period and saying, how am I going with those? Because I can modify each one of those. And as you said, there's a 45% correlation with if you modify those things, a 45% be like a better outcome.
Yeah.
People have better outcomes. In other words, they don't die from something or other.
Yeah.
Apart from genetics and those things you can't control.
Yeah.
I mean, we might have a disposition for something to happen to us.
Of course. But even within that disposition, you can still modify your outcomes by, again, addressing these risk factors. So even if you've got a predisposition, if you still address these, you can improve, delay outcomes. It's just
and that's an important thing too, because most people probably don't realize that dementia that comes about as a result of some genetic predisposition only represents a very small percentage of the total amount of people get dementia, like a really small percent. I don't know about dementia, but I know in motor neuron disease it's something like 4% or something like that. Like might even be less, which means there's 90-odd% of people who get motor neuron disease. Something else has caused this. It's randomized. I think they call it random, but it's a random occurrence. And if there's modifiable risk factors in relation to any of those diseases, dementia, Parkinson's, motor neuron disease, it's anything to do with the brain, then it's a no-brainer. Pardon the pun, but it's a no-brainer to look at this stuff and think about it.
Yeah,
at least, and think about it. And that's why this research that you guys do in Neuro is so important. Like these are really I don't want to denigrate them. They're very simple, complex, but they're simple for us to address as just laymen, like simple things for us to look at. And I would like to talk about, let's call it Alzheimer's. I know dementia sort of sits above everything, and Alzheimer's is one of the limbs under dementia, forms of dementia. If we could just look at Alzheimer's for a second. When it comes to metabolic health or poor metabolic health, and is it fair to say that poor metabolic health I'll start the question again. Is it better to say that poor metabolic health is correlated to dementia, highly correlated to dementia, or significantly correlated in a statistical sense? Or is it better to say it's a cause?
Good question, Mark. I mean, a lot of what
there is a question mark in there.
Good question, Mark. Look, a lot of what we do, it's you know, in a perfect world, you take, not ethical, but you would take something and look at something directly. So when we're looking at the human population, it is technically all correlational, but I know in some animal models where they can control this a bit more, they have seen direct causative outcomes. So, with a pinch of salt, it's very highly correlated.
And more than statistically significant. And by the way, statistical significance isn't a big percentage. It's not that big a percentage. So you're saying it's more than significant. It's correlated, but you're saying it's probably close to being causative, but you can't prove it, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's very hard to say that as a scientist without being able to do. But look, there's very strong evidence that these things we can do can really impact. And as you say, the things that are accessible to us are relative. I know it's not perfect, but relatively attainable for most people. So it's worth probably implementing them as best you can anyway.
Yeah.
Obviously there's things we can't control, but, trying, as you say, increasing physical activity, that for a lot of people is within their control. So you may as well probably give it a bit of a crack.
Yeah. And if people say, oh, well, I haven't got time to go to the gym, or I can't afford it. Probably a socioeconomic issue. Like I can't afford to be a member of a gym. Fair enough. But wherever you live, I'm sure there's a road and there may be a park. There's no reason you can't go for a walk or a run for that matter. It's free. Or even if someone says, well, yeah, but I got kids to look after. I'm a single mother or a single father. I can't leave the house because my kids are little. Okay, well then do something inside the house. Do sit-ups, push-ups, pull-ups, whatever you can. Run on the spot. That requires a certain mentality. I get that part, but there's probably fair to say activity is really unrestricted in terms of whether you can or can't do it. You may not want to do the running on the spot at home. I get it, but if you want to avoid these outcomes and you have constraints relative to money or time or opportunity, then you've got to do whatever you can. And it sounds easy. It's easy for me to say, of course. Here I am sitting here and I have time to do these things and the money to do these things. But nonetheless, it is a truth. Whether it happens or not is another matter, but it is a truth. Apart from exercise, or call it movement, probably prefer exercise as a better outcome. Apart from diet, are there any other things that can create poor metabolic health? Take genetics away, but apart from those two, are they the two main factors? Exercise and in terms of lifestyle.
Yeah, in terms of lifestyle.
So apart from and also you were saying social interactions. Why is that important?
I mean, I think how it relates is again probably in the wider sense of having that sense of community and encouraging sort of well-being and looking after yourselves, reducing stress, which in itself can have an inflammatory effect. So that's probably one aspect. As I said before, there's an element of depression, and obviously social engagement can help mitigate that. That was one of the modifiable ones. But going back a little bit to what you were saying about exercise, I will just interject there. I think your grandmother was a good example, who someone I'm assuming didn't do a formalized exercise regime.
But she moved.
And I think that's also maybe another element the reason why we feel we need to have it more formalized, is because our lifestyle has become so much more sedentary than it was. Yeah. Less movement. So, people, as you say, used to do a lot more incidental movement, right? So a lot of us are more sitting at our desks or driving a lot or whatever. But your grandmother, like you say, she was up, she was cleaning, she was cooking,
everything.
She grew everything, she was in the garden. So I think even if, as you say, maybe that's not accessible or formalized regime for everyone, just increasing that incidental exercise as much as you can. Matthew's another good example. He takes the stairs everywhere. He doesn't take the lift. He takes the stairs, and I try and take public transport and then walk a bit more. I know 10,000 steps is bandied around, but one of the big studies did actually find around 9,800 steps was a good starting place. Yeah. So just trying to get a bit more of that incidental exercise is moving in the right direction, even if you are time poor, resource poor, and what have you.
And I was only thinking about this the other day, this step business, and because I wear a monitor, and I wear a Whoop, and it does tell you the number of steps you're taking a day. And I thought to myself, well, how do I get to 10,000 steps or beyond? And one, you got to be. It's hard. No one's walking around counting the steps, okay? And you'd be surprised how much. I was surprised as to how much walking I have to actually do to get to 10,000 steps. And let's say for example, I catch a train to work, and the station, my office is opposite Martin Place, for example. Maybe one thing you could do is, instead of getting off at Martin Place, you get off at Town Hall.
Great example.
Catch the train earlier and walk, one extra station. It's probably 15 minutes either way. So you just put a half an hour walking onto your regime, which probably gives you the 10,000 steps.
Yeah.
I think it's important to have something that can measure these things, only because I take the view, if you can't measure, you can't manage. So, if you're trying to manage something, you've got to be able to measure something. You can't go, oh, maybe I did 3,800 steps, because most of us wouldn't have a clue. I wouldn't. But it sounds very trite and commonplace for me to say this, but I've even started, where I can, I will walk to the studio from my office when I get an opportunity. So I'm in this studio maybe 3 times a week. My office is in the CBD in the city. This is on the fringe. I actually measure the distance. So I drove it. I just use my car odometer to measure the distance. I know it's 1.2 kilometres to my office to here. If I walk here, particularly in the winter when it's better than when in the summer it's a bit too hot, but if I walk here, then I've got to walk back. There's 2.4 Ks walking. It's okay. It's not bad to add to your whole regime. I mean, I make it part of my total regime. And I think consciousness is really important, which is why this show is important, and have people on like you is important for us, is to say to people, whilst there's a lot of complicated science, and some of which is, in debate, it doesn't really matter. We don't really, us as the audience, don't really need to sort of settle on the science, because you guys will do it over time. You'll all argue and debate and write papers and get peer reviews and, blah, blah, blah. And you do your best, and it'll continue on, and Neuro will continue to get more neuroscientists in there, and you'll build bigger and more information, and you'll start to connect all the groups who are doing different aspects all over the place. And maybe in 20 years' time, it could be too late for me then. I mean, in 20 years' time, you might have a real settled pattern of how it should all be put together. But when we're listening to the show, really what we're trying to take out of this is that it's pretty simple. Like, we're going to die from cancer, heart attack. It's in this order: heart attack, cancer, brain disease, or something metabolically caused, which could be any one of those three, from having poor metabolic health. And this is the first time I've actually ever really talked to anyone properly about metabolic health. But it's pretty much manageable. or you can give yourself a fighting chance, put it that way, if you just do some simple stuff.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. Like, I need to get blood to my brain. Then, Mark, you make sure the blood will flow and you don't have too much plaque in your system, or you don't have a blocked artery, the carotid arteries, or and the way you do that is you don't eat crap and you get some movement, exercise. And even if I don't care who you are, no one can say, I'm that busy, I can't do exercise. Even if it's just, I don't mean formal exercise, any form of exercise, like you say. It's not formal. So my grandmother, like you just said, like she was out in the garden, picking stuff up, carrying it to the house. There was no Uber deliveries in those days. If you wanted stuff, you grew it yourself, or you went to the shop yourself and you got it and you brought it home and you prepared it. It's very interesting. So would you like to maybe just cap us off on metabolic health and brain health? Like, just where would you like us to end on this in this discussion? What would you like to say about our metabolic health relative to our health of our brain?
Look, I mean, like you say, on paper, it's relatively simple. I will acknowledge it's, there's complexities there. We're obviously living in a time and an environment that is, not that conducive to the simplicity of what we'd like to do. A lot of our food is designed to be very moreish. And as I said, there's implications that there's areas of the brain becoming inflamed by even these foods and these diets that make it harder then to even feel satiated. And like you say, we live in busy, hectic lifestyles with lots of stress and what have you. So, but I think, going along with the Gen Zers sort of movement of self-care, I think, like you say, trying to carve out a bit of that time for you and to put these, stitching time saves 9, we're super busy now, but if we can try and put a little bit into eating well, exercising, increasing that exercise, doing those basic things like sleeping well, going to your GP, controlling those potential conditions. If you've got high blood pressure, get that under control. If you've got diabetes, obviously have that well regulated. So I think that's probably the overarching message, is controlling what we can for our longevity. So investing now, while you're a little bit younger, so that you can be one of those super agers in your 80s. We're all living longer, that's a blessing, but we want to live well into our old age, not just live longer. And I think these are steps we can take towards.
And that's a very interesting point you make, Hannah. It's particularly if you're younger, it's not a time to think I'm bulletproof. It's a time to think, now I'm going to invest.
Yeah.
I mean, we invest in our super from the day we get our first job. They're getting us ready for the day we turn 65. 65, I'm not saying it's too late. If you're 65 and you haven't done anything, you should start.
Totally.
But it'd be much better if you had started when you're 25.
Yeah.
And because, you probably won't need to start at 65. You have already started. And it's a bit like saving up for your retirement. You want to retire, because the reason we save up for our retirement, we put superannuation away, is so we can retire well. We can live a financially secure life, well optimized. We're in a position and we're allowing ourselves to take a holiday, to enjoy the things that we've worked hard on, we pay taxes for. Well, there's sort of the same thing investing in health.
Definitely.
So when you retire, you can live well.
But in saying that, it is never too late. Though there is still evidence to suggest even those people who do end up with cognitive decline, if they then are implementing exercise, they have better outcomes and things like that. So, it's always good to, like everything, the earlier you invest, the better. But making it those lifelong habits, or, even if it is later, you can still feel a lot of benefit and improve your longevity by engaging in those habits. So it is never too late. That's also that's good.
Maybe Dr. Hannah Timmons has just come up with another saying that Neuro can adopt: invest early.
Invest early. Invest well.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Bob.